I still remember the sound that morning. Not the drone of our own engines, but something deeper, angrier, like thunder scraping across the clouds. It was November 7th, 1943, a cold day at the airfield near St. Pol, in northern France. I was a Luftwaffe engineer then, stationed at a maintenance hangar attached to the 3rd Experimental Detachment. We were supposed to be repairing a crippled Focke-Wulf 190. Instead, we were about to meet the enemy in a way no one could have imagined. The alarm never came. No air raid sirens, no frantic radio chatter. Just a distant roar. At first we thought it was one of ours returning from patrol. Then the aircraft broke through the mist and the hangar went silent. It wasn't one of ours. The shape was all wrong. Too fat, too heavy, with wings thick as armor plates and a nose that looked like it could punch through stone. The markings were clear even through the fog. A white star on blue, the insignia of the United States Army Air Forces. Someone shouted, "Americaner!" But no one moved. The plane was descending, slowly, carefully, wheels down, flaps extended. No smoke, no panic. Whoever was inside was landing, not crashing. I remember the moment its tires kissed the ground. A heavy thud that shook the windows. Dust exploded around it. And for a heartbeat, we simply stared. A Thunderbolt, whole and alive, had just landed on a German-occupied airfield. The pilot must have realized his mistake too late. The canopy opened. A man in an olive-green flight suit looked around, hesitated, then raised his hands. He looked young, barely older than the mechanics beside me. A pistol clicked somewhere behind. Within seconds, he was surrounded. That's how it happened. The capture of Lieutenant William E. Roach, and with him, the capture of America's most powerful fighter. We didn't know it yet, but that morning changed everything. The officers came within the hour. Colonel Felt, head of our technical division, barked orders. Do not touch it. Do not remove anything. Photograph everything. Our squadron photographer, a man named Richter, ran around the plane like a child discovering fire. From up close, the Thunderbolt looked monstrous. A machine built not for elegance, but for endurance. The skin of the fuselage felt thicker than any German aircraft. The rivets were heavy, almost industrial. Even the smell was different. Oil and ozone and something sweet, like new rubber. On the tail, someone had painted the name Beetle. A small cartoon insect in goggles was charging forward under a banner of stars. It was absurd. A smiling beetle on a machine of death. We towed it into Hangar 4, and the colonel ordered guards at every door. Within hours, telegrams went to Berlin, then to Rechlin, our top-secret testing facility. They were sending a team. That night, no one slept. When the specialists arrived 2 days later, the hangar turned into a cathedral. We watched as the engineers from Rechlin surrounded the Thunderbolt with clipboards and flashlights. Their leader was Hans-Werner Lerche, the Luftwaffe's best test pilot, the man who had flown everything from Spitfire to a captured B-17. He stood before the P-47 and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we are about to learn what the enemy truly builds." The dismantling began. Every panel, every wire, every hose was cataloged. I was assigned to the power plant team. When we opened the cowling and saw the heart of the beast, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, the room went silent. 14 cylinders, twin rows, a labyrinth of turbo ducts, intercoolers and fuel lines thicker than a man's wrist. We had never seen anything like it. One of the mechanics whispered, "It looks more like a factory engine than an aircraft's." Lerche only nodded, and yet it flies faster than our best. We began measuring the parts. Everything was overbuilt, thicker bearings, deeper cooling fins, generous safety margins. German engines were precise, efficient, but fragile. This one looked like it could run forever. When we examined the turbo supercharger, hidden deep in the tail, the colonel frowned. This cannot work," he said. But it did. A turbine in the rear fed compressed air through long ducts to the engine in front, maintaining power even at 30,000 feet. It was a design so complex that no German aircraft had anything close. We had tried years earlier, but gave up. Too heavy, too intricate, not worth the effort. Yet here it was, working perfectly in a plane that had just flown across the channel. That night, I wrote in my notes, "They build machines the way we build fortresses." When Lerche flew it for the first time, we all gathered outside. The American markings had been painted over with black crosses. but the name Beetle still shone faintly beneath the fresh paint. He taxied to the runway, throttled up, and the earth shook. The sound of the R-2800 at full power was like a thunderclap echoing inside your chest. Then the Thunderbolt rose, not gracefully, but with brute strength, climbing like a hammer thrown into the sky. We watched until it vanished into the clouds. When it returned 20 minutes later, Lerche climbed out, pulled off his gloves, and said simply, "It flies like a tank that learned to dance." The others laughed nervously. I didn't, because I knew what he meant. The tests continued for weeks. Every flight brought new discoveries: higher ceiling, unmatched dive speed, astonishing survivability. The thick armor plating around the cockpit could stop rifle fire. The self-sealing fuel tanks refused to ignite. One afternoon, we fired on it with a captured Browning .30 caliber to test the repair panels. The bullets barely dented the skin. At night, Lerche dictated his notes. The P-47 displays power reserves unmatched by any German fighter. Its climate altitude is sustained and its acceleration remarkable. This is not a machine built for precision, but for dominance. He handed me the pages to type. I still remember the last line he added before signing. "If they can produce these by the thousands, we cannot win this war." By December, word had reached Berlin. The report was classified Geheime Kommandosake, top secret. But among the engineers, the truth spread quietly. Germany's finest minds, Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, all received copies. Each drew the same conclusion. The enemy's advantage was not genius, but industry. They could afford to make everything stronger, heavier, more redundant because they had the factories, the materials, the oil. We were craftsmen. They were manufacturers. In war, we realized, belonged to manufacturers. That winter, I returned to Rechlin with the Thunderbolt. It had become both a trophy and a ghost, a symbol of what we admired and feared. Sometimes I would walk past it in the hangar, the sunlight reflecting off its aluminum skin, and feel a strange mix of pride and despair. We had built beautiful aircraft, the FW-190, the Bf-109, machines of elegance and instinct. But this was something else. It was not beautiful, it was inevitable. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear the engines growl in my sleep. It was the sound of power, the kind that no longer cared about borders or flags. And in that sound, I think we all heard the future coming, fast and unstoppable, long before the war was lost on paper. When the Thunderbolt arrived at Rechlin, the winter fog was so thick you could barely see the far end of the runway. The guards saluted stiffly as the transport truck rolled in, carrying the plane under a gray tarp. Someone had scrawled "Beetle" on the canvas, as if even secrecy couldn't erase its name. Inside Hangar 3, the lights buzzed weakly. We gathered around as the crew unveiled the machine. The same olive green monster that had landed in France, now scarred from tests but still proud. Its aluminum skin caught the pale light like dull silver. To us, it felt less like an airplane and more like a warning. Hans-Werner Lerche stood beside it, coat open despite the cold. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Gentlemen," he said, "today we stop guessing, we learn." Rechlin was Germany's temple of flight. Every new aircraft, friend or foe, passed through its doors. You could smell the mixture of oil, burnt rubber, and ambition in every corridor. Posters on the walls showed silhouettes of the Messerschmitt Me 262, the rocket-propelled Comet, the flying wing prototypes, our supposed future. And yet, that winter, the most crowded hangar belonged to an American. We began by stripping the P-47 down again. Each team had its assignment: power plant, hydraulics, armament, structure. I was part of the systems analysis group. We started with the gun base. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, linked to enormous ammunition belts that looked like something from a battleship. Each gun had a simple feed system, robust and easy to reload. The barrels were replaceable in minutes. One mechanic shook his head. They built this like they knew they'd never have time to rest. He was right. We had elegant cannons, the MG-151, the 108 Malawian Quaches, masterpieces of precision, but finicky and sensitive. The Americans built their weapons like farm tools, rough, efficient, unstoppable. Next came the power plant study. We placed the R-2800 on a test stand, feeding it fuel through a labyrinth of gauges. When we fired up, the entire hangar shook. A wave of heat and vibration hit us like a physical force. The engine roared at 2,000 horsepower without complaint. Our lead engineer, Vogel, yelled over the noise. "Look at the boost pressure. It's holding steady, steady." He pointed at the manifold gauge. Even at simulated altitude, the turbo supercharger maintained pressure perfectly. The long ductwork that we had mocked in France suddenly made sense. Vogel muttered, "They solved the problem of altitude power by brute force." We Germans had chased efficiency, reducing weight, optimizing airflow, polishing every surface. They had simply overwhelmed physics with horsepower. By February, Lerche had flown the Thunderbolt 5 times. He logged his impressions meticulously. Handling, heavy but stable. Roll rate, moderate at low speed, excellent at high dive. Climb, acceptable at 6 kilometers, exceptional above 8 kilometers. Cockpit visibility, limited forward, excellent lateral. Controls, stiff but precise. In the margins, he wrote one line that was not for the report. "This aircraft feels immortal." We said that aloud. No one laughed. One afternoon, I stood beside him as mechanics refueled the plane. Snow drifted through the open doors. Lerche watched the fuel hoses and said quietly, "You know, when you fly it, you stop thinking of it as American." I asked what he meant. He smiled faintly. "It doesn't care who built it. It only cares about air and fire. Machines like this, they belong to whoever understands them." Then he walked away to his next briefing, leaving me with that thought burning in my head. Inside the officers' mess that evening, arguments broke out. Messerschmitt representatives claimed that their new Bf-109K would match any Allied fighter. Focke-Wulf men countered that the FW-190D had better low-altitude acceleration. Someone from Heinkel slammed his glass down and shouted, "None of that matters. The Americans can build 10 for every one of ours." The room fell silent. Everyone knew it was true, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Our technical reports grew thicker each week. Data tables, cross-sections, performance charts. One page stood out. At the bottom, Vogel had written, "This machine demonstrates industrial capability beyond replication within the Reich." Berlin didn't like that phrasing. They crossed it out and replaced it with, "Certain components exceed domestic production standards." That was the German way, bury defeat under grammar. By March 1944, rumors spread that another captured P-47 had been found in Italy, wrecked but reparable. The Luftwaffe wanted to compare results. But fuel shortages, bombed rail lines, and bureaucracy slowed everything. Our Thunderbolt remained the only complete specimen. Meanwhile, Allied bombers grew bolder. Every week, formations of B-17s crossed the skies above Rechlin, escorted by swarms of fighters, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Lightnings. When we heard their engines, we recognized the sound instantly. The same growl that came from our hangar echoed across the heavens in numbers we couldn't imagine. Lerche would look up sometimes, shading his eyes, and mutter, "So many, that's what industry sounds like." The pilots who fought them sent desperate messages. "Cannot climb with them above 8,000 meters. They dive faster than 190s. Cannot follow. Armored cockpit makes head-on attacks useless." We knew why. We had the proof sitting on our floor. One night, while reviewing flight data, I asked Vogel if we could ever match this. He stared at the engine block and said, "Match? Perhaps, but not build. We no longer have the metal or the time." That was the first time I saw defeat in an engineer's eyes. Still, the Reich demanded optimism. Our reports were edited before being sent to Berlin. Words like impossible became difficult. Phrases like beyond our means became requires further study. But among ourselves, we used a different language, silence. That was how we spoke about the war now. Lerche continued flying. He compared the Thunderbolt with the FW-190A-8 in simulated dogfights. Observers on the ground said the American machine outdove its German rival every time. It could stay in a vertical dive longer without losing control. After one such test, Lerche landed, climbed down, and wiped frost from his goggles. He looked at me and said, "Do you know what I fear most?" I shook my head. That this is not even their best aircraft. Inside the documentation office, I read through the American flight manual found in the cockpit. Still intact, still smelling faintly of tobacco and oil. The instructions were written simply, almost like for a farmhand. No complex formulas, no delicate warnings. Everything was about practicality and safety. Engine rough? Reduce manifold pressure. Too hot? Increase airflow. Remember, the airplane will take more punishment than you think. That sentence stuck with me. More punishment than you think. It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. I closed the manual and realized our war was built on faith and brilliance. Theirs was built on faith and reliability. Spring came late that year. The snow melted around the hangars, leaving puddles that reflected the plains like ghosts. Every day we heard news from the front. Retreats, losses, cities burning. And still we tested. The Thunderbolt became part of our daily routine, a foreign heart beating inside a dying body. Lerche named it Schicksal, fate. One afternoon, while recording engine data, a fuel line burst and fire erupted under the wing. We rushed with extinguishers. The flames died quickly, leaving only black streaks. The damage was minimal. The American fuel tanks had sealed themselves just as designed. Vogel laughed bitterly. Even their fires are disciplined. The final evaluation report was submitted in April 1944. I typed the closing paragraph myself. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represents a combination of engineering robustness, power output, and manufacturing precision that cannot be reproduced under current wartime constraints. Its performance at altitude, resilience to damage, and reliability under stress exemplify a level of industrial mastery presently beyond the capacities of the Reich. I hesitated before typing the last line, then added it anyway. In the air, it is a machine. On the ground, it is a verdict. When Lerche read it, he said nothing. He simply nodded. Weeks later, Allied bombers hit Rechlin. The raid was short but devastating. Several hangars were destroyed, including ours. When the dust settled, the Thunderbolt still stood, battered, scorched, but intact. It had survived its own autopsy. We gathered around it in silence. Some saluted, others turned away. No one dared call it an enemy anymore. Looking back now, I realized that the day the first P-47 landed on our soil, the war was already over. We just hadn't read the report yet. By the summer of 1944, we no longer looked up to the sky for hope. We looked up for warnings. The distant rumble of engines that once filled us with pride now meant only one thing. The Americans were coming again. Every morning the sound arrived first. A low drone from beyond the clouds, like a storm rolling in from another world. Then the sky would darken with silver specks. B-17s, hundreds of them, and above and around them, like guard dogs circling sheep, flew the fighters we had come to know too well, the Thunderbolts. From the ground, they looked majestic, almost beautiful. From the factories beneath, they were apocalyptic. At Rechlin, we had stopped testing new designs. The war was consuming steel faster than we could measure it. Fuel was rationed, aluminum diverted, rubber scarce. Our engineers still came to work, but mostly to salvage data from machines already destroyed. The Thunderbolt remained inside Hangar 4, its paint faded, its once polished cowling dusted with ash. It was no longer a trophy. It was a reminder. Sometimes Lerche would walk past it, run his hand over the wing, and say quietly, "I wonder how many of its brothers are out there now." We both knew the answer was more than we could count. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. Thunderbolts were everywhere, escorting bombers, strafing trains, tearing columns of tanks apart in minutes. Pilots spoke of their speed, their endurance, their cruel silence as they dived out of the sun. Even the SS men in the mess hall had stopped calling them flying bricks. They called them Die Hammer, the hammers. One afternoon, a telegram arrived from Berlin. Air Ministry requests comprehensive evaluation of Thunderbolt production process and potential replication within Reich facilities. We laughed. There was no fuel for the cars outside, no coal for the power plants, and they wanted us to replicate America. Still, we prepared our reply. Vogel and I spent 3 nights drafting the document. We compared industrial statistics. Germany could produce 2,000 fighters per month at best. The United States was producing over 7,000. For every P-47 we shot down, 10 more took its place. Vogel ended the report with a line that I will never forget. We fight the enemy's machines today. Tomorrow we will fight his factories, and that battle is already lost. Berlin crossed it out. By September 1944, Rechlin was no longer safe. Allied bombers had mapped it from the air. We could see their contrails like threads of white knives across the sky. Orders came to move the Thunderbolt south to a hidden facility near Merseburg. We crated it up, piece by piece, and watched the truck disappear down the road under the gray clouds. I never saw it again. Without the machine, the silence felt deafening. But its shadow remained. We could see it in every Allied raid, hear it in every sky. The Thunderbolt was not just an airplane anymore. It was a soundtrack to defeat. One night in October, a group of pilots arrived from the Eastern Front for debriefing. They were thin, pale, their uniforms threadbare. One of them, a major named Koch, said he'd faced Thunderbolts near Warsaw. They come in pairs, he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. They don't turn with you. They rise, they climb like nothing I've ever seen. We can't follow. We die looking up. No one spoke after that. That winter was the coldest of my life. The hangars froze, the pipes burst, the diesel congealed in the lines. Sometimes we used pieces of scrap wood from damaged airframes to feed the stoves. One morning, I found Lerche sitting alone by a barrel fire, reading his own report. He looked up and said, "You know what the problem is? We built machines for heroes. They built machines for men." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. In March 1945, the Americans crossed the Rhine. By then, the sky was theirs entirely. P-47s and P-51s roamed Germany like hawks over an open field. Trains could not move by daylight. Factories worked underground. We listened to the radio and heard our leaders speak of miracle weapons, rockets, jets, vengeance machines. But we knew better. We had seen the real miracle, mass production. When the first Thunderbolts appeared over Berlin, I watched from a rooftop. They moved in perfect formation, unhurried, unafraid. Their contrails drew lines of geometry across the sky, a mathematical proof of inevitability. Explosions rolled through the city like waves. Glass rained down in a glittering storm. And in that moment, I felt no hatred, only clarity. This was not punishment, it was physics. In April, as Soviet troops closed in from the east and Americans from the west, I was ordered to destroy our remaining documents. We burned files for 3 days straight. Blueprints, photographs, flight data, years of work turned to smoke. When I reached the folder marked Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, captured specimen, I hesitated. Inside were Lerche's notes, Vogel's calculations, and my own pages typed months earlier. The final entry read, "The Thunderbolt demonstrates that industrial supremacy is a weapon unto itself." I couldn't bring myself to burn it. I hid the folder inside a metal tool cabinet behind a false panel. If the Russians found it, so be it. Let someone know we had seen the truth. A week later, Rechlin was bombed again. This time the Thunderbolt was gone, either moved or destroyed. We never learned its fate. But sometimes I imagine it's still sitting somewhere in a barn or a forest, its metal bones resting quietly while the war around it turned to dust. When the surrender came in May, I was standing outside what was left of our workshop. The radio played static and the voice of a foreign broadcaster reading the terms of unconditional capitulation. I remember the wind lifting ashes from the rubble and thinking, this is what it sounds like when a nation exhales. A pair of P-47s passed overhead, low and slow, their wings flashing in the evening light. They didn't bomb, didn't shoot, they just flew. The war was over, but their sound remained. Years later, When I stood in a ruined factory turned museum, I saw one again, a restored Thunderbolt gleaming under spotlights. Children pointed at it, awed by its size. A guide told them how it had helped liberate Europe. I stood in the back, hands clasped behind my back, and felt something strange, not bitterness, not shame, but respect. Because that machine, the enemy's machine, had taught me more about my own country than any speech or flag ever could. It taught me that we lost long before our cities burned. We lost the moment we believed perfection could replace production and pride could replace power. And it taught me that in the end, the sky belongs not to the brave, but to the prepared. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still dream of that sound, the growl of the R-2800 cutting through the clouds, steady as a heartbeat. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of truth. The war ended, but the noise did not. For months after May 1945, Germany hummed with the sounds of surrender. Trucks on broken roads, boots on cobblestones, typewriters hammering out lists of the defeated. Every day, another order, another form, another inventory of what remained. And what remained was almost nothing. I was taken by the British near Lübeck, together with a group of engineers from Rechlin. They called us useful prisoners. We weren't soldiers anymore, just minds to be questioned. Our uniforms were gone, our notebooks confiscated. But the questions never stopped. They wanted to know about our work, the engines, the tests, the captured aircraft. They were polite, professional, and relentless. One of them, a Royal Air Force officer named Captain Reeves, kept a notebook bound in blue leather. He asked me, "Did you ever fly the Thunderbolt yourself?" I told him no, I was only an engineer. He smiled. "Pity, you might have liked her. She's quite a lady in the air." The way he said it, affectionately, almost tenderly, made me realize that for them the war was already history. For us, it was still a fever. After a few weeks, they moved us to an interrogation center near Hanover. They fed us decently, gave us cigarettes, even newspapers. Most of the headlines were about Nuremberg, about trials and crimes and names I didn't want to read. The articles spoke of guilt as if it were a measurement, something you could assign in kilograms. But guilt doesn't weigh that neatly. When they asked what I thought of the war, I said the only honest thing. It taught us how small genius becomes when it runs out of fuel. The translator didn't write that down. In 1946, I was released. Germany was a graveyard pretending to be a country. Cities looked like open engines, all gears, no covers. The rubble was our new landscape, and in it, people began to build again because there was nothing else to do. I found work with a small repair company in Hamburg. We fixed anything that could fly, crop dusters, mail planes, occasionally a battered Dakota left by the Allies. For a time, I shared a workshop with two Americans from an occupation technical unit. They were friendly, curious, almost naive. One afternoon, one of them, Sergeant Miller, rolled open the hangar doors, and there it was again, a Thunderbolt shining in post-war sunlight. It wore new markings, white circle, red stripe, but the stance, the bulk, the presence, unchanged. He patted the fuselage like an old dog. "She's one of ours we left in Europe, still runs like a clock." I stood there, staring at the same plane I had once dissected in secrecy, now standing openly under Allied stars. For a long moment I couldn't speak. Then I said quietly, "Yes, she was built to outlive us." Miller didn't understand the depth of what I meant. In 1947, I was invited to work for the Allied Technical Evaluation Program. A strange irony. The same engineers who had once studied enemy aircraft were now helping the Allies understand German ones. I joined because I had no choice, and because deep inside, I still wanted to be near machines that flew. We tested the remains of Messerschmitts and Dorniers, measuring, cataloging, comparing. Occasionally, they brought in Allied models for cross-reference, Spitfires, Mustangs, even a few Thunderbolts. Every time I saw that massive Pratt and Whitney engine start up, something twisted inside me. It was like hearing a voice from past life. Captain Reeves appeared again, now working as a liaison officer. He greeted me warmly. "Glad to see you on the right side of the hangar this time." I smiled thinly. "There are no sides anymore, Captain, only directions." He laughed. "You sound like a philosopher." I didn't tell him that philosophy had never saved a single pilot. That year, we performed a joint demonstration flight, a German Me-262 jet and an American P-47 side by side. The jet was faster, more elegant, but unstable. It hissed like a serpent and drank fuel like fire. The Thunderbolt roared, steady and sure, circling gracefully before landing without incident. After the flight, Reeves turned to me and said, "The jet looks like tomorrow, but the Thunderbolt sounds like victory." He was right. The jet symbolized what we had dreamed of: speed, superiority, perfection. The Thunderbolt represented what we never understood: endurance. In 1948, as Germany split into zones and ideologies, I left the military field and joined a civilian aviation company that would later become part of Lufthansa. We repaired old American transports and British engines, learning from the designs we had once envied. The engineers who survived the war now worked in overalls instead of uniforms. We spoke less about honor and more about tolerances, thrust, and cost. It felt cleaner somehow. But late at night, when the hangars emptied, I sometimes walked alone among the machines and listened to the ticking of cooling metal. It was the same rhythm I had heard in Rechlin, only softer now, like repentance made mechanical. In 1951, during a training exchange in France, I saw a squadron of P-47s one last time. They were lined up along the tarmac, freshly painted, ready for delivery to a new Air Force somewhere in South America. A French technician, noticing my interest, said proudly, "Still flying after all these years, indestructible, these beasts." I ran my hand over the wing's surface, smooth, cold, alive. Under my palm, I could feel the faint vibration of the hydraulic pump. The smell of oil and avgas filled the air. I thought of Lerche, of Vogel, of all those days spent measuring, doubting, fearing. We had studied this plane as an artifact of superiority. Now I saw it as something pure, proof that ingenuity, when guided by reason instead of ideology, could endure. By the mid-50s, Germany's skies were peaceful again. Commercial aircraft replaced fighters, carrying mail instead of bullets. The roar of the R-2800 gave way to the whine of turbines. But sometimes, on summer days, an American pilot flying east would pass over Hamburg in a restored Thunderbolt, just for display. Its shadow would sweep across the ground like a slow-moving cloud, and for an instant I would be 20 years younger, standing in that hangar again, listening to the voice of power. And every time I heard it, I whispered the same sentence under my breath: power without hatred. That's the only kind worth building. In 1957, I visited the United States as part of an exchange between aviation companies. They took us to Connecticut to the Pratt & Whitney plant. Inside the assembly line, I saw hundreds of engines, polished and perfect, humming like an orchestra of thunder. An engineer proudly said, "We built these the same way we did during the war, just quieter now." I wanted to tell him that I had once examined one of those engines in a frozen German hangar by candlelight, but I said nothing. Some truths are better left in silence. As we toured the facility, he asked, "So, what did you work on back then?" I smiled. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Years turned into decades. The world changed, the jet age came, then space, then computers. But the Thunderbolt never disappeared completely. I saw it in museums, air shows, even postage stamps. It became part of humanity's collective memory, not as a weapon, but as a lesson. I once attended an air show in England where an old P-47 flew alongside a Spitfire and a Mustang. Children cheered, veterans saluted. When it landed, people rushed to touch it, as if it carried some ancient blessing. I stood in the crowd, unseen, and thought, yes, it does. It carries the blessing of survival. In the early 1970s, I wrote an article for an aviation journal titled "The Day the Thunderbolt Landed." It was anonymous. I signed only with my initials. It described not the war, but the engineering, the design philosophy, the materials, the systems. Readers praised it for its objective tone. They never realized it was written by a man who had once stood on the other side of that philosophy. Now I'm an old man, and the world has new machines, new wars, new arrogance. But sometimes late at night, when the wind rattles the windows, I hear it again, that deep, distant growl rolling across time. The sound of the double wasp engine, turning steadily, forgivingly, as if to remind me that history's engines never really stop. And I remember what Lerche said the last time I saw him before he died. Perhaps the Thunderbolt was never an enemy. Perhaps it was a teacher. He was right, because in the end, that machine outlived its war. And so did we. I never meant to tell this story. For many years, it lived only in notebooks, folded between pages of reports no one read anymore. Then one spring afternoon, a young journalist found me. His name was Jonas. He said he was writing a piece about the captured aircraft that changed the war. Someone in an archive had told him I was still alive. I laughed and said, "Then the archives are too curious for their own good." He was polite, earnest, with that modern kind of confidence born from peace. He carried a small recorder and asked if I minded being taped. I didn't. I'd spent half my life recording the past. It seemed fair that the past should finally record me. We met at a small airfield outside Munich, where an old warbird association kept a restored P-47 Thunderbolt. It gleamed in the sun, polished to perfection, its propeller blades as black as obsidian. On the nose, painted in white letters, was a familiar name, Beetle. I stood there a long time, unable to move. For an instant I was back in 1943, hearing that same engine growl across the French fog. Jonas noticed my silence. "You've seen this one before, haven't you?" I smiled faintly. Not this one, but her sister, they all sounded the same. He switched on his recorder. "Tell me what it was like the first time you saw it." And so I did. The words came slowly at first, cautious, mechanical, like turning an engine that hasn't run in years. But once they began, they wouldn't stop. I told him about the landing in France, the astonishment in the hangar, the first test flights at Rechlin, the fear that followed every discovery. He listened without interrupting, only nodding, his eyes wide behind his glasses. When I finished, he asked, "Did you hate it?" I thought for a moment. "No, you don't hate something that shows you the truth. You hate the truth itself." He frowned. And what was the truth? That we lost not because we were weak, but because we believed arrogance could out-engineer reality. He wrote that down carefully. Later, we sat in the hangar cafe watching the pilots prepare for the afternoon flight. The Thunderbolt's engine coughed, then settled into that deep rolling rhythm I had not heard in decades. The smell of avgas drifted through the open door. Jonas leaned forward. "When you hear that sound, what do you think of?" I looked out at the runway. I think of how something built for destruction ended up surviving longer than everything that justified its creation. He smiled. "That's poetic." "No," I said softly, "that's history." The plane began to taxi. Children pressed against the fence, waving little flags. The pilot raised his hand in salute, and a massive propeller blurred into a circle of light. The roar filled the valley, echoing off the hangars like distant thunder. As it lifted from the runway, I felt the ground tremble under my feet, the same vibration I had felt in Rechlin so many years ago. But this time there was no fear, no shame, no sides. Only admiration. The Thunderbolt climbed, turned slowly, and made a low pass over the field. The sun flashed across its wings like a blade of silver. Then it rose higher, leaving behind nothing but the growl of the double wasp fading into blue. Jonas switched off his recorder. "Do you ever think machines have souls?" he asked quietly. I chuckled. "No, but they remember the hands that built them and the eyes that watched them fly." He wrote that too. When the show ended, the crowd dispersed, but I stayed. The pilots wheeled the Thunderbolt back into the hangar, closing the doors behind it. The air grew still. I told Jonas one last thing before he left. Every generation thinks its machines will save it. Ours taught me they never do. But sometimes, if we're lucky, they save the lessons instead. He nodded, shook my hand, and promised to send me the article when it was finished. I never expected he actually would. 3 months later, a package arrived in the mail, a magazine with my story printed across 8 pages. The title read, "The German Engineer Who Fell in Love with an American Plane." I laughed so hard I cried. But when I finished reading, I realized Jonas had understood more than I thought. He hadn't written about machines. He had written about people, about fear, discovery, and the strange peace that comes when an enemy's creation becomes part of your own memory. Now I keep that issue on my desk beside a small model of the Thunderbolt, carved from aluminum scrap. Sometimes visitors ask why a German keeps an American plane on display. I tell them the same thing every time, because she reminds me that truth has wings. I'm old now. The years have worn me down like a propeller polished by wind. But on quiet nights, when the rain taps against the roof, I can still hear it, that steady hum of the R-2800. It no longer sounds like war. It sounds like forgiveness. I wonder sometimes what happened to Lieutenant Roach, the man who accidentally delivered us our lesson. I later learned he survived the war, came home, and flew again in peace. 2 men, 2 sides, 1 sky. If fate has a sense of humor, perhaps one day we'll meet in whatever hangar waits beyond time. We'll stand together, look at that old machine, and both whisper the same word: respect. The last time I saw the Thunderbolt fly was 2 summers ago. A younger pilot took her up during a heritage flight. When she climbed through the clouds, her silhouette burned against the sunlight, the same defiant profile I first saw in 1943. Everyone cheered. I just closed my eyes and listened. The sound was enough, because that sound, that endless, rolling thunder, was the heartbeat of an age that refused to die. If you ever hear it too, don't turn away. Listen closely. It's more than metal and fuel. It's the echo of every hand that built, every mind that questioned, every soul that finally understood. Machines end, but the stories we tell about them, those never stop flying. So if you are hearing this now, if the engine of history still hums in your chest, if you believe that truth deserves witnesses, then keep listening, keep remembering, and stay with us, because the sky is full of secrets. And here, on Battlefield Secrets, we keep them alive.